Richard Lawson stood by his office window, gazing at the city skyline, but his mind was elsewhere. It had been 23 years since Emily was taken from him. The world had changed, his wealth had grown, businesses flourished, but deep inside he remained frozen in the past, trapped in the moment he lost her. Nothing had ever filled the void she left behind. Not the lavish penthouse, not the luxury cars, nor the constant praise of people who admired his success. They only saw Richard the billionaire. They didn't see Richard the grieving man. That evening, as his chauffeur pulled the car into a dimly lit street, Richard caught sight of a young woman huddled on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. The city's usual cold indifference surrounded her. People passed by, pretending not to see. Something about her stopped Richard in his tracks. Her eyes, deep, weary, yet familiar. He rolled down the window. "Sir?" his driver asked, confused. Richard hesitated, then pulled out his wallet and stepped out. He crouched down, holding out 3 crisp $100 bills. "Take this," he said. The woman looked up, her gaze flickering with something unspoken. Not gratitude, not hope, something else. After a long pause, she reached out and took the money. "Thank you," she murmured. Her voice was soft, barely a whisper, but something in it made Richard's chest tighten. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just done something more than offer charity. He got back in the car, expecting to forget about her by morning. He was wrong. Richard couldn't get the woman out of his mind. He had encountered hundreds of people in need before, but never had a single moment stayed with him like this. That afternoon, he returned to the street, expecting to see her again. But the alley was empty. Disappointed, he turned to leave when he saw her. She was walking down the street, clutching something in her hands, heading toward a cemetery. A familiar cemetery. Richard's breath hitched. No, it couldn't be. Without thinking, he followed her. Through rows of headstones, past memorial plaques, she walked with purpose, until she stopped. Richard stopped, too. She was standing at Emily's grave. His stomach dropped. The woman knelt, placing a single white rose at the headstone. Richard stepped forward, his heart pounding. Who are you?" She turned, and this time he saw it. The resemblance. "My name is Sophie," she said quietly. "Emily was my mother." The ground felt like it was shifting beneath him. That's not possible." Sophie's expression didn't change. "I thought so, too. Until I found this." She pulled out a worn letter, its edges frayed with age. "I found this among my mother's things," she said. "It's from James." Richard's blood ran cold. James, an old friend, someone Emily had once trusted. His hands trembled as he took the letter. James had written it 23 years ago. "Emily, you have to tell him. Richard deserves to know. You think keeping the truth from him is protecting him, but one day, Sophie will grow up and wonder why she never knew her father. Please, don't let her believe a lie. I know you fear what will happen. I know you worry about Richard's pain. But love isn't about shielding people from the truth. It's about facing it together. If you wait too long, the chance may be gone forever." Richard's hands clenched around the paper. His vision blurred. Emily had kept a secret from him. A daughter. His daughter. Richard took a shaky breath, looking at Sophie. "Why now? Why come to me after all these years?" She hesitated. "Because I wasn't sure you'd believe me. Because I wasn't sure I wanted to know you. But then," she glanced at the grave, "I kept having dreams of her. Like she was telling me it was time." Richard swallowed hard. "You never knew," Sophie continued. "But James did. He wanted my mother to tell you the truth. But she was afraid." "Afraid of what?" Richard demanded. Sophie met his gaze. "Afraid you wouldn't want me." Silence stretched between them. Richard's heart twisted. The years lost. The conversations never had. The life he could have been part of. And then, Sophie said something that shattered him completely. "I have a son," she whispered. "His name is Daniel." Richard's breath caught. I have a grandson." She nodded. For the first time in 23 years, Richard felt something break inside him. The grief, the anger, the loneliness. It had all led to this moment. Richard didn't have the right words. There was no way to erase decades of absence. But as he looked at Sophie, he realized something. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about making sure history didn't repeat itself. "I want to meet him," he said, his voice raw. Sophie studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's start there." That evening, Richard walked into Sophie's small apartment for the first time. His hands shook as he stepped inside. And then he saw him. Daniel, a little boy no older than 3, clutching a stuffed bear. His eyes, Emily's eyes, stared up at Richard with innocent curiosity. "Mommy," The boy whispered, "Who's that?" Sophie knelt beside him, her voice gentle. "This is your grandpa." The words struck Richard like lightning. "Grandpa." Tentatively, he knelt down, his voice shaking. "Hi, Daniel." The little boy blinked. Then, after a moment, he grinned. Richard smiled back, his heart full for the first time in decades. Because in that moment, he understood. Life had given him a second chance. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. Weeks turned into months. Richard, once a man defined by loneliness and regret, found himself waking up to something new, purpose. He and Sophie built their relationship slowly. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And Daniel? He became the light in Richard's life. One day, as they visited Emily's grave together, Richard placed a hand on the tombstone. "I wish you had told me," he whispered. "But I understand now." Sophie squeezed his hand. She wanted to protect us both. Richard nodded. As they left the cemetery, Daniel holding his hand tightly, Richard felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Emily was gone, but in her place, she had left behind something far greater. A daughter, a grandson, and a future worth living for. "You said